So welcome again. I'm so excited for everybody that is able to join us live. And of course, if you're listening to the recording, welcome to you as well. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about the content in certification success, create your personalized study plan. And the approach is going to be pretty experiential. As Ashley indicated in the intro, we're going to talk through some experiences that some adult learners who were prepping for exams had, and what they learned, and what I learned from them, and hopefully what you can take away from that. So just a couple things about what we are going to talk about. First of all, with certification success, every copy of the book comes with a one-time use passcode to assessments through human e-sources. And I'll actually show some screenshots from human e-sources in the presentation, just so you have a heads up though. Not necessarily, if someone is prepping for an exam, they may not go through the process of doing an assessment of how they learn, what kind of environmental factors they should consider, all of that. There's still plenty to learn if you don't do that, but just so you're aware, that will be part of what I'll be talking about, and we'll give you a little more info on that later on. And then the other thing I wanted to let you know is I highly recommend, and you can go ahead and raise your hand if this applies to you. Nobody will know if you've been it. If you have just gone to a webinar and listened for an hour and got all this great information and felt inspired, and then turned around and did nothing with the info. To help you hopefully not do that with today's information, I want to encourage you to do one simple thing. Just try to identify 3 things that you can do to move yourself forward in your certification prep. I'm probably going to give you, 30 ideas that will apply to your environment, but don't try to take them all and make them work. Just grab 3 and move forward from there. And you can always circle back, as we shared. There'll be a recording, and as you kind of check things off the list, you can come back and do more. But just try to pick 3 things today, and it'll get you off and rolling and increase the chances that you'll actually do something. So the book itself helps people create a successful prep strategy. Doesn't matter what exam you're studying for. It also helps people make the most of how they process information. We're going to talk a little bit about the fact that we all grab onto information and work through it in different ways. Everyone is capable of every one of the intelligences we're going to talk about today. It's just that some of them we are naturally more inclined towards than others. So you get to make the choice. Do you want to use the skills that you have and are comfortable with very naturally, or do you want to maybe develop ones that would help you in the work that you're doing? And then the last bullet, and this is the one where I always sense people don't always believe me, it's making preparing for your exam a little bit more enjoyable. Now, this isn't to say that you're going to fake being sick so you can stay home and study instead of going out with your friends because exam prep is going to become so fun, but it does mean that, oh boy, so many of us, we want to do something like prep for a certification exam, and the process is so painful, we come up with every excuse in the book to not get it done. We're going to close that gap and make it something that you actually enjoy doing, so that when you do carve out time and you do sit down to work on stuff, you actually do it. So as I already shared, the book itself talks about the theory of multiple intelligences. I alluded to that, I guess. It's based on a theory by Howard Gardner. That might be one of the 3 things you want to look up. You might want to read a little bit about his theory of multiple intelligences. It is covered in the book. But knowing a little bit about that, even just a short summary of all of the intelligences can sometimes help people understand how they are inclined toward processing information. And then we'll talk a little bit about motivation, your environment, and even your personal experiences. So I invite you to actually start thinking about that now. Maybe if you have a pen and paper handy, think back to when you were in high school or college or a community ed class or a training class at work, and you had either a really good experience or you had a really bad experience. Either way, jot it down and try to identify what it was that didn't work for you. And this is an okay time to be just super honest. If you didn't like the facilitator, that's a legitimate block toward learning. if the content was, if you had a reward at the end of the training session. Sometimes people don't want to admit that they're extrinsically motivated. There's nothing wrong with that. If that moves you, make a note of that. Just try to think about kind of some of your own experiences, no matter how unrelated they may seem. It could easily be something that you could transition into this prep. So all we're going to do today is we're going to talk about reviewing the prep materials you have access to, some of your intelligence preferences, and how you might modify materials. And we're going to do that while talking about 3 specific examples of students prepping for 3 very different exams and kind of what their approach looked like and what they did. So first off, this is a pretty straightforward way to start. Before you sit down and figure out how long you're going to need to study, when you're going to take your test, mapping everything out, you have to figure out what materials you're working with. And no matter what exam you are prepping for, there's going to be something out there. There's going to be a website or a book or videos or a class that you can enroll in, or a self-directed class, or there's any number of things. There are hundreds and hundreds of certifying bodies out there, and they all have their own take on education. And a lot of times it's kind of connected to how their average certificant learns. But it might not be a perfect fit for you, so just take a look and see what's out there. I encourage people to look at this info in a couple of different ways. First of all, look for paid resources and free resources. And I always caution people against, first and foremost, like just jumping in and buying the most expensive prep package they can find. And the reason is, you might guess this, it doesn't, whatever approach that they formulate for you, it may not actually be the best way for you to learn. Just because it works for most people, or just because it's the most expensive option that they have, it actually, in this case, doesn't necessarily mean it's the best route for you to go. It might be, and a lot of the courses that are out there are absolutely they result in the highest success rate. You know, when people go all in and they really commit and they purchase a class and they have to show up at a certain time, you know, those tend to be the biggest investments, and so therefore they have the highest success rate. But just before you do that, just pause and think a little bit about what it is that you need. The second bullet there is looking at resources from the community. Now, I don't mean like your city community. I mean the community related to your field of study. So if you're considering project management, just take a look around at social media sites, look at whatever agency you're working through, look at discussion boards, see who is out there and sharing what info. I'll give you one kind of cautionary tale. Be very careful to avoid any sites that have answers to the test or anything that would be ethically questionable. The reason for that, of course, so the reason, other than just you should know better than to do that, but other than that, it's very risky to have any kind of engagement with that type of an environment, because most certifying agencies, if they find any kind of behavior like that associated with you passing your exam, not only will they oftentimes take away your certification, it's not uncommon for you to then be banned from taking the certification again at any point in the future. So, and they're pretty serious about cutting back on cheating, and they do a lot of sweeping. So most certifying agencies will regularly go through and make sure that there aren't people out there selling, you know, materials and answers to the tests and things like that. But if you do happen to stumble across something, just make sure you steer clear of it. And then the third bullet is, depending again on your exam, sometimes, especially if it's a very popular exam, there could be materials that are available through external education groups. So for example, one of the people we're going to talk about today was studying AdWords. And there is I know an author who wrote a book about passing the AdWords exam. So he's not at all affiliated with Google. His materials aren't integrated into the available AdWords prep, but he's just out on his own, and he kind of took it upon himself to share his approach. And not every exam has that. Usually it's obviously the larger ones that would have an external group, but especially if you're looking for different approaches, that can be a really, really good way to find info. Something to be careful of related to that is that obviously the certifying agency is always going to have the most up-to-date information. That's the safest place to grab info. So if you do go to an external body, just make sure that the information they're sharing is up to date and accurate and gets good reviews. So we're going to start by answering the really important question of what is it that you need to successfully complete your prep. So I'm going to invite you to jot down anything that immediately comes to your mind when you see this question, because we're going to talk about a few different things, but if something popped into your mind, write it down. So for example, talking to people, a common thing that comes up is people say, you know what, I've got to get my spouse on board with this because I know it's going to mean a couple extra hours of studying. I know it's going to mean, it's going to affect. I think this is something that people overlook when they go back to school, when they study for an exam. Our lives are all intertwined. So when we take on a big project like this and we don't involve the people in our lives, that can actually create a stumbling block for us in the future, because all of a sudden you are leaving for work an hour early in the morning so you can study when you get there, or you're working an hour late, or you're not going to a soccer game or something like that, so you have time to study. And if you don't talk through that, it can be problematic and slow down your overall prep. But before we get into that, let's talk about one easy one. So this is actually a screenshot from the Human Resources Assessment that I shared with you. You might be able to figure this out on your own, but I personally love doing assessments like this because when you go through, particularly this Human Resources one, which obviously having integrated in the book, I became very familiar with. The thing I love about this is there are components that you don't even think about that will come up on this assessment. Now, this is about, 5% of the information in the assessment. It's just a snapshot. Because each of these, you can kind of see on the left-hand side, it has a little drop down that tells you more about what you need in your environment. And this is no joke. When you're studying, you have to think about your environment. And you may not be able to get everything perfectly set, but you may also be able to pretty easily identify things that are either preventing you from being able to focus that could easily be modified, or maybe even things that are interrupting you. So not even just that you're not getting as much out of your study time as possible. They may actually be like preventing you from doing anything. So for example, the first line is intake. It refers usually to food, water, things like that. How important is that to you? Our second line is light. This is my assessment result, by the way, which I always think it's really funny when you're super far left or right on something. So clearly I need a really bright room when I'm studying. And I can attest to the fact, however I answer these questions that this came up, that is 100% accurate. There is just something about a low lit room that just relaxes me or puts me too much to sleep or something. So this is spot on. But honestly, before seeing it in black and white, I don't know that I necessarily would have thought about it. So if I go to a coffee shop to study and I look around and I say, okay, where am I going to pick to sit? One consideration is, what's the lighting like in all these different areas? Because if I pick the squishy chair in the corner, that's kind of dark, I'm not going to study, I'm probably going to nap. So there you go, we don't want that. Casual or traditional setting. This one is important for a lot of people. Some people think they have to sit at a desk if they're going to get anything done. And for some people, that is right. There are absolutely some people that they can't sit in like a reclining chair and get studying done because they just can't engage in the way that they need to if they're too relaxed. When do you study best? This is another one. I'm way to the right. And I actually did know this one early in the day or late in the day. By the way, for none of these, there's no right or wrong answer. These are just all things to think about. So when I'm studying for something or doing something very challenging, I do it first thing in the morning. And then the tasks that I have to complete that are less intense, I do later in the day. I'm just more effective early in the morning, which is when you want to schedule your prep time. How about background noise? Some people have more focus with more background noise. That's not a made up thing. As you can see, I'm a quiet in the background person. And then temperature, that's another important consideration. If you're uncomfortable, you're gonna find it really hard to settle in. So are there more environmental considerations? Probably, but the human resources assessment actually covers this really nicely, I think, and gives you some things to think about. And hopefully, more importantly, either in this webinar as we talk through these elements or when you actually take the assessment yourself, you learn a little bit about yourself that can kick up the effectiveness of your prep just a notch. The next one is intelligences. So this is referring to Howard Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences. And intelligence's reference in this way sometimes is a little odd. If you don't work in the education field, it might not be something that you have heard about. But essentially, there are, as you can see, 9 intelligences that Howard Gardner has identified. And if you take an assessment, there are other ones, but the human resources one I think is probably the most thorough one that I've seen. What it does is it populates how strong you are in this particular skill set. Now, it's very, very, very important for you to understand that every single person has the ability to tap into these intelligences. So if you complete an assessment like this and it comes out, so for example, my lowest ranking intelligence is kinesthetic, which explains why if you throw a ball at me, I'll probably drop it. It's just not something that I'm naturally super good at. That doesn't mean I can't do anything in this realm. I practice yoga on a daily basis. I play tennis. There are all kinds of pieces of my life that have a kinesthetic component. But whenever I tackle them, it probably takes me a little longer to get there than someone who has a higher ranking intelligence category. Same thing if you look at my top ranking intelligence, which is linguistic, which probably not too terribly surprising considering I wrote a book and here I am, I'm a speaker. So you may have already guessed like, oh, kind of makes sense. People who like words gravitate towards these types of fields. It happens a lot that way. What we are good at a lot of times kind of aligns us with our job choices and where we end up. So unfortunately, because of the limited time, I can't go into all of the intelligences. I do encourage you though to look them up. And I encourage you to think about how they apply to you, how they might apply to people that you know, and see if you can kind of bring some of them to life. So I wanted to give you an example. So we've got a list of the intelligences here, but I wanted to give you an example of how someone who has a existential, which sounds kind of weird, but really refers to like big picture work, how someone with an existential view might look at it. So they would want to see everything all on one page, just like we're looking at it now. But somebody with a visual or spatial orientation, they may prefer to learn about Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences with a graph that looks something like this. Now, what's the difference? It's largely the same information. I guess the chart has a little bit more detail in it. But for some people, they gravitate towards this look, and some people would much prefer sorting by color, having a nice balance, because a circle like this, on top of having all of the keywords, it also demonstrates that there isn't one or another that's more important than another. So again, I just want to use this intro to intelligences as kind of a double whammy to introduce the fact that there isn't a right or wrong way to look at information, but there are always multiple ways to look at it. So sketching out something like this would likely appear to that spatial visual intelligence. And the last piece is motivation. So in the human resources assessment, this is under the category of mindset preferences. And I think when people look at this, what I get the most feedback on is when they share the motivation measurement. And you can see there's other components there as well. But it's important to identify what it is that gets you moving. It doesn't, again, there's nothing good or bad here. I think a lot of people misinterpret this as saying like if something comes on as having low self-motivation, sometimes people interpret that and they say, oh, that's bad. That means I'm lazy, or it means I don't get things done. But that's not what it means at all. It means that if you are looking to get something done and you've made the decision that you're going to accomplish something like prepping for an exam, it means you have to put checkpoints in place that are external from yourself to keep you motivated. So that could be your spouse checking in on you. It could be reimbursement for what you paid for a prep class at 3 different completion points. There's all kinds of different ways to motivate yourself. And the point is, if you don't have a strong internal self-motivation, you just need to be aware of it. You just need to take a look at this and go, oh, I have to set my environment up a little bit differently because I'm just not wired that way. I'm not wired to get out of bed an hour early, 5 days a week, and do this prep. I gotta have something else that is moving me forward. Again, nothing wrong with that, just something to be aware of. And then authority motivation as well. It is something that you can integrate into your environment. If you have someone or something that can kick you kind of into high gear, maybe a person, authority can be anybody, right? A focus on your work. So can you multitask, do different things at once? So again, this is mine that we're looking at here. And this is a really accurate representation. I actually struggle if I only have one thing I'm working on, which maybe that sounds weird, I don't know. But I like working on things in pieces. I like working on projects a couple hours at a time here and there. And where I honestly have the most trouble is when I'm down to like one big chunk of information I have to work through. It's the most difficult for me. Just like the intelligence is, it doesn't mean you can't do it, but it's the most difficult. So it's just realizing, okay, how do I have to break things up depending on how much focus I can have on any one topic. And structure and then working with others, independent versus collaborative, are pretty straightforward. But also, even if you don't take this assessment with the one that you automatically fill out with the book, these are just things to think about. What kind of structure do you need? Do you want to work with other people? Do you want to work alone? And try not to think about what is easiest for you, but rather think about what you think would help you be most effective. Because your next step then is going to be, so remember now we've assessed all of our materials, we know what's available to us, and now we're figuring out, okay, how do I have to modify my materials? And really not even just my materials, but my environment, getting people on board. Do I have an office to work in? Is there a good space? It's a small thing, but so for me, if I go study like in a coffee shop, it's like a little treat. I set aside a couple of hours. I buy myself probably a drink that has far too many calories in it. I settle in. I have my little noise canceling headphones, and it's kind of this overall experience because I've set myself up with the right materials, with the right environment, and I'm mentally in the place to start working through everything. So let's try an example. So if the materials that you're working with for whatever your exam is, doesn't matter what you're studying, applies to everybody. Let's say this is what you've got. You've got a book, you've got practice exams, and you've got videos that you found from other community members. So your top ranking intelligences are interpersonal and kinesthetic. So that means interpersonal means you like to engage with other people, and kinesthetic means you do very well with movement. So being active is an important part of your learning process. And your lowest ranking intelligence is linguistic. So that means probably grabbing words off the page is everybody's capable of it, but that is the hardest way for you to process the information, to really get meaning from it. So looking back up, that book that you've got is going to be a little challenging, right? Because reading a book requires, for meaning, requires high-ranking linguistic intelligence. Taking a practice exam, well, it's a little bit more interactive. It's better than the book, but still kind of a lot of reading. And then videos from the community is probably our best shot, right? Because it's interpersonal and it's got a little engagement there. So let's just go back. We've got our book, our practice exams, and our videos. What would we do? So before reading through the book and doing all of your assessments, what you would have done is you would have sat down and suffered through reading the book and you just would have done the best that you could. You probably would have done something like reading before bed, which is never a good idea because I don't care who you are. Well, that's not true. I suppose if you are high ranking on that night owl kind of setup, it might be okay. But for the majority of people, if you're tired, it's not the best time to be absorbing information. You probably would have watched the videos, and you probably would have done that first because that of everything was probably the most appealing to you. And then you probably would have taken the practice exams as kind of a way to figure out what you'd be doing. But after you read the book, you think a little bit about your approach, you think a little bit about what it might mean for you to create a healthier study environment, you might go forward and form a study group because you have this interpersonal, high-ranking interpersonal intelligence. It means you're good with people. You do really well when you read a short paragraph and then talk about it, or when everybody in the group has a small amount of material they're responsible for and they come back and share it. You might also watch the prep videos while you're riding a stationary bike. And by the way, if you ever do read or listen to content while you're exercising, always do so safely. I have to add a little public service announcement there. Unfortunately, you can get really engrossed in something. It can end with, you stepping into a pothole and twisting an ankle or something like that. So always do so safely, but integrating some kind of movement while you're learning, you now know, hey, that taps into my kinesthetic learning. And then there you go, you don't change anything with the practice test. Maybe you take the practice test so you can identify what you need to study in more detail. So this is not overly dramatic, right? These were small changes that simply because you took the time to think about what it is that you can do to modify your environment and change your approach makes your life a lot easier and honestly more effective. You're grabbing more of the information that you're then going to be able to share on the assessment. So let's hear from our three people. I will tell you their stories. Prepping for really different exams. A business exam, business marketing would be Google AdWords, a nursing exam, and then construction management. All right, so Google AdWords, a couple of years ago, what would happen when you would log, they always had free training, and the AdWords certification is also free. They were very gracious about letting people retake it as needed. You had to wait a week, but otherwise you could just keep taking it till you passed. But this was what their prep guide looked like. And it was a linguistic learner's dream, right? But if you were really any of the other intelligences, you looked at this and you just kind of started crying. They about, let's see, I think it was the beginning of this year, they launched an amazing new study program, which was actually a series of videos that you would work through. And they also provided this kind of list of, as you worked through each of the components for the exams, you could kind of like check it off. So when we look at this, I already shared this, you can probably see right off the bat, the student that I was working with, this was actually one of the students in my in one of my university classrooms. She took a look at this and literally couldn't get past like the first page. It was visually overwhelming. Looking at all the words on the screen and kind of trying to figure out how to organize it and put it in buckets. Because by the way, this training is still available. Even though they launched this other training, they kept this linguistic approach because it really does work well for some people. The student I was working with not only couldn't absorb the information, but it gave her anxiety. She felt overwhelmed looking at the material. And I share this because it is very possible that you will have the same or similar feelings, and know that that isn't abnormal at all. It can be very overwhelming, especially at the beginning of a prep when you start to make your plan. So she actually fell into this category of a visual spatial learner. She was much more inclined towards pictures, graphics, video, things along those lines. The exact same content presented in this format where she clicked through the materials, watched the videos, and she actually opted to take notes while the video was playing. And that was something that she and I had talked about because she struggled with focus. So remember our little focus diagram, like being focused on one thing or multiple things. She really struggled with that. So one way to kind of overcome that is to take notes and to carefully watch what it is that you're, or take notes on what it is that you're watching, so that when you circle back and study later, you can have the video, or maybe even marking the minute mark in the video if there's something you want to go back and see again. But it's a completely different experience. Same content, completely different approach. And here's another one. So this overview, whether you realize it or not, if you love lists or checklists like this, it's a little reminiscent of that existential learning style. That means to you, it's important to understand the big picture. So when my student was working on this, she found herself gravitating towards looking at this list and making plans. okay, so I've got to do this many more minutes of video. Okay, I can do that by Tuesday. Okay, if I do that, then I should be able to test by Thursday. And always thinking about that big picture and how the information would fit into her actual exam and exam prep was off the charts important for her success, because she could see the finish line. She always knew what she was working towards, and the hard work she was putting in had value because she could check something off that list. Huge, huge motivator. Now, when she was actually working through the content, that existential element had a similar value, because the content itself is designed so that they constantly are talking about how the information she was learning would be used in her everyday life as a marketer. So that's, again, tapping into that existential component. So if you do find yourself as a top ranking skill being in that existential realm, and you're struggling grasping onto specific content, a lot of times it's because what's missing is you don't get why you have to know it, right? You're a busy person, you're smart, you know all of this stuff, so you naturally just kind of want to let go of this stuff that you don't feel has a value. Overcoming that, of course, is figuring out what the value is. So, excuse me. So another approach is an exercise called the SQ3R. The SQ3R is an exercise that is widely used in schools, but it is 5 steps to help you work through information. This is another great one for the existential approach. You'll also see it taps a little bit into linguistic, but it involves going through and surveying the material you're looking at. So remember our example where we had the book and the practice exam? Those were kind of our 2 main videos. You might take the book and survey it. So that means you flip through the content and you get kind of a general idea of what's in the book. I shouldn't say book. You would want to do this probably a chapter at a time. So you kind of know what's coming. With that in mind, just skimming the content, figure out, this is your question stage, identify and note what questions you've got about the material. After that, you go back and do the reading. So you read the content and think about how you should change your environment so that you are more effective in your reading just from the basics. So I have here an example being reading out loud, using a highlighter, anything that you've kind of figured out in your personal educational history that helps you read and understand information. Recite the answers to your questions. So remember your second bullet, you listed out kind of things that you wanted to learn. This is your opportunity to answer those questions as you go. And then review, you circle back and reread the answers to those questions that you had come up with. And you might even take a little time out here and follow a path to research any of the questions that you hadn't resolved. So if you can't see this, if you haven't seen it already, I would encourage you to take another look and think about that existential or big picture approach and see how this could potentially be an exercise that could tap into your approach that could be really helpful if that's your top intelligence. So I have a couple more exercises like this that I'll share with you, but in the book, how the book is set up is you take your human resources assessment, and then based on that, it's kind of like a choose your own adventure. You jump into the chapter that goes through your top ranking intelligence. And at the end of the chapter, you have 3 exercises kind of like this that gives you some options about how to tackle the materials that you're working with. And then for each one, there's also 3 suggestions from other chapters that could potentially work for you as well. All right, so let's go ahead and take a look at some nursing exams. So we're getting to be kind of a pro at this now, right? So we're understanding how we're looking at information. So let's talk about what a nurse might do. And a nurse might go to get ready for the exam that he or she is going to prep for. Let's say he takes an exam, he finds out he's interpersonal is his top ranking skill. So he looks at this and he's like, oh my goodness, there's a lot of content here depending on what it is I'm going to tackle. Whatever path he chooses, if he is has that top ranking interpersonal intelligence, a fantastic option is discussion boards. So discussion boards are fantastic in that they are very accessible. So especially for people who are struggling to find time to prep for their certification exam, the nice thing about discussion boards is they're typically asynchronous. So if you are contributing at 1 in the morning or noon or whatever, and wherever you are in the world, by the way, it doesn't matter because you're not time bound. So it's really helpful. But that there isn't, it's not a perfect setup, because the challenge a lot of people face with that is they commit to discussion boards, but they don't actually participate. So it's kind of a voyeuristic approach that I see. They'll go to discussion boards and they'll read and they'll be like creepers, right? But they don't actually sit down and write content. And that can happen for any number of reasons. Sometimes people don't feel confident sharing answers. Sometimes they don't think they have time. But I'll tell you, if you are just reading discussion board posts, that's linguistic intelligence skills that you're tapping into there. If your top ranking intelligence is interpersonal, you need that other component of actually contributing, of jumping in, of responding to people, of processing information, of sharing stories, and talking to them. Now, a discussion board can also, that kind of engagement can be mimicked by a study group or something along those lines. But I like to talk about discussion boards, especially for that interpersonal intelligence, because I think people undervalue them, and they think things like, well, it's they're so easy, or it's just retyping what's in the book. I don't really learn anything from it. 9 times out of 10, you're not approaching the discussion board with the right mindset if those are the feelings you're having. So I always recommend that you either agree with something someone posted and then expand on it, right? So don't just say, hey, great post, I really appreciated it. That's worthless. It's not helping you, it's not helping them. Maybe they feel like, oh, what a nice person. That's it. You're not learning anything. But agree with them and then dive a little deeper. Share why you agree with them, and maybe add your own story. Or the second approach is disagreeing, respectfully, of course, but you can say, I don't see things that way. And then you explain why. Believe it or not, disagreement usually generates the most learning because it provides that alternate perspective. Or the third thing you can do on a discussion board is you can ask a question. So if you really are engaging someone in a conversation, try asking them a question. Don't be a jerk about it, right? Don't ask a question that you could find by Googling it, right? Don't just generate work for people. Actually think of a question that could move the conversation forward. So let's say the same nurse is existential intelligence. Well, good news for that student as well. Most certification exams have a candidate handbook. If you have not downloaded the candidate handbook associated with your certification exam, go do that, especially if you are more inclined towards that existential learning style, because almost always there's a detailed outline of the content for the exam. So let's take a look at our very last participant. It is our friend who is taking, is in the industry of the construction industry, taking a CMAA, and this is what you find at the site. So if you started doing your research, we're all like super good at this now. We know that would be our first step. We see, okay, I can do an in-person training, or I could go to this e-learning center. Those are some fantastic options, right? Also, if I go to YouTube and I kind of pull up some of these CCM exam materials or some of these options, there's tons of videos that are available on YouTube. Now, I pulled up 15,700 results. Are all of those going to be fantastic results? I'm quite sure they will be. So it takes a little creativity. You have to modify your search terms, maybe get a little bit more specific, or you might find that when you find a video that's very good, you might find that the actual content creator has created other ones. So that can be a great way to sort through some of those free resources. But back to, whoa, my presentation got a little away from me there. Back to our considerations. If I'm that interpersonal learner, remember that interpersonal learner that likes groups, likes engaging with people, I may not be as inclined towards sitting at home and going through the videos. It might be a really good idea for me to invest in this in-person training, or even doing an e-learning kind of an approach. But My top-ranking intelligence is this visual spatial component. Videos might be exactly where I go, and a nice add-on might be figuring out what are the ways I can integrate images, sketches, photographs, timelines, pictures that I could arrange in a meaningful way, and then group by topic or by some way that will push me forward through all of the other materials, challenging or the stuff that I know, grouping all of that content in a way that will help me bring meaning to it as a learner. So as you saw, we went through and talked about the different steps towards getting ready and creating your certification prep plan. And that first step really is understanding what works for you. So I just want to, before we send it back to Ashley to answer any questions that anybody submitted, I just want to remind you to take 3 things away from the webinar that you might like to go and explore. It could be going and figuring out, maybe taking some time to think about how do you learn best. It might be having that conversation with your family about, hey, this is something I want to embark on, and really setting yourself up for success by finding a manageable number of things that you can go out and accomplish today, and then map out the steps that you need to take to be successful from there. So with that, I'll send it back over to Ashley to see if we've got any questions from the group.
Yeah, nice job, Amy. I did have a few questions come in, so I'll just start asking those.
Sure.
First one is, how long should it take to research and create a study plan? How do you know if you're over planning or just wasting time?
So that is a fantastic question, and probably something that we have all experienced in one way or another. I'm sure that you will guess there's no one right answer, because not only are exams very different in the amount of content that is available and how much time it takes to get organized, but people are very different too. Some people will immediately, this question of what do I need to be successful, some people immediately know the answer. I mean, there's just something that resonates with them right away and they're off and running. And for other people, they may not have thought about this for 20 years. I mean, it might require them to really sit down and work through the material. So I would say I can give you one guideline. So I recently started prepping for a new exam, and it took me about 30 minutes, and the materials themselves, about 6 hours worth of prep. And the reason it took me 30 minutes for 6 hours of materials is because this was one that actually had a lot of external components and things that were available. I would say when I worked for the National Institute for Social Media, and so people work to become certified social media strategists. There's a lot more content that we go through. I would say those people probably plan for about an hour, but it is a more detailed, more rigorous exam. So if you go more than probably an hour in planning, you might want to take a step back and make sure that you're staying focused.
Okay. What's your favorite study tip? Maybe one that works for everybody?
Yep, that is another good question. And I think probably the Pomodoro technique is the one that I get the most positive feedback from. So if you're not familiar with the Pomodoro technique, it's Pomodoro. It is a time management system. And the reason that this works for so many people is because most people struggle with an accurate concept of time. So what will happen is they will either think they're studying a lot and not be studying very much at all. And I should say, what comes of that then is frustration. So for example, if you thought you studied for 20 hours and you went and you took a practice exam and failed miserably, that's really demotivating, right? Deflating, it's depressing. And if you looked back though, and you really acknowledged the fact that, okay, well, I set an hour aside to study on Tuesday night, but 5 minutes into my studying, my kids came in and interrupted me. So even though I had an hour of studying on my calendar, I really only studied for 5 minutes. And, it just kind of, the Pomodoro technique maps out how you spend your time in 25-minute increments. So it kind of forces you start a timer, and you keep track of exactly what you do. When the timer goes off, after the 5 minutes goes, you just go back and you jot down what you worked on, what you accomplished, what happened. And when that time goes off, if you realize, oh, I'm playing with my kids, I wasn't studying at all, at least you can update accurately how you spent your time. So when you go to take your practice exam, you go, oh, I only studied 4 hours. I probably am not ready to take my practice exam yet. And you just have a more accurate understanding of where you're at. It also keeps you from spending too much time on any one thing. So this is the opposite of kind of where I was going before. So this is the opposite of I'm on module 1 and there's 20 modules to prep for my exam and I put like 10 hours in. Well, is that too much? Can I really commit to 10 hours for every module? It just kind of helps you map all of that out and make a more effective plan. Reading is one that a lot of people, I'll ask them, how long would it take you to read 50 pages? And they have no idea. And why would they? When do you ever pay attention to how many pages you can read in how much time? It's just not a common question, but that Pomodoro technique can really help map that out.
Okay, I have a third and final question. If you're studying for an exam that doesn't have any materials shared by other test takers, what's the best way to share and get materials from others?
Yes, so that is not impossible. You certainly could go out and look for resources and find that no one has created anything. And then I would just always encourage people, there are so many platforms that allow you to share and create groups and be the initiator of shared content, that I would encourage you to start something. You could do something as simple as opening a Facebook group and seeking out people who are around the world pursuing similar goals. They can kind of divide up and just create some study materials with other people. And a way to find those people, which might be your next question of, well, that's great, I can have this place for everybody, but how do I find them? I've always found certifying agencies, they want people to get certified, right? So they're going to do their very best to help you in any way that they can. So it might be as simple as saying, sending a message to maybe their info email or something like that, saying, hey, I'm looking for a group, I'm looking for some resources, and they might connect you to a group you haven't found yet, or they might put a message out for you or be able to help you kind of find some of those same people studying. So I think the short answer is, if you can't find people who have created community resources, this is your opportunity to lead in your industry and kind of be the forerunner for setting up that kind of group work.